Hi everyone, Carl Steele. This is for English 4113, 4114 for spring 2022, continuing our study of notions of human development and of so-called primitive people, with the story of Victor of Aveyron, who lived from possibly 1788 or 1790 to 1828, and the person who sought to, quote unquote, civilize him, Jean-Marc Gaspard Itard, who lived from 1774 to 1838. You have read the work, so I don't need to summarize it. And you can also watch videos that talk about the story of Victor of Aveyron online on YouTube, and you can watch them at rapid speed so they go by quickly. One of them is narrated, in fact, by Leonard Nimoy, who played Spock in the original version of Star Trek, and that's kind of an unusual thing. You could even watch the film by Truffaut called L'Enfant Sauvage, The Wild Child, made in 1970. There's also a couple of novels about him, so he's not an unknown figure. But I do want to stress a few things that maybe you would have found confusing or strange about the book by Itard. So this is written in revolutionary France. That is why he's calling everyone citizen. And that is why the months have such unusual names. One of the things the revolutionaries did was abandon all the old names of the months and to substitute them with revolutionary names, which had to do with the progress of the new revolutionary civilization. So when you encounter those things, that's what's going on. There's also a small amount of untranslated French in this work. Dieu means "oh God," and lait, L-A-I-T, means milk. So now you know that. So the background for this work, which you're not going to hear in the other videos on this figure, has to do basically with 17th and 18th century European intellectual life. So here's a picture of Aveyron in 1890. I'm going to show you a picture of it taken just a couple of hours ago on the next slide, and you'll see that not a lot has changed. I mean, now, of course, it has internet and paved roads and electricity and running water and all these things. So you are possibly familiar with Hobbes in Leviathan in 1651 and his argument that the life of humans before civilization was, quote, nasty, brutish, and short. And if you read the whole passage to which that famous quotation belongs, you'll see that he's primarily talking about humans living in a state of war. And he's not making a strong argument that humans prior to civilization necessarily live in a state of war in which they're always trying to kill each other. It's really, he's talking about, I think, the situation of large-scale civil war in Europe at that time with the religious wars. But he does make reference a couple times to the Americas and to American Indians. And one of the arguments he makes is that there is no philosophy without leisure, and there's no leisure without civilization, because without civilization, you have to spend too much time trying to feed yourself. And so that is his argument, is that while American Indians might be rational and they might have crops, they don't really have philosophy. And so to that, of course, I can say compare Dario / Condillac in the dialogue with L'Entend. That's what that CF means. It's from the Latin confer. It means compare. It's not C period, F period, it's CF period. So you get a sense that if Hobbes had talked to an actual Native American and had a conversation with them, as Mandeville possibly, not Mandeville, Montaigne possibly did, and as L'Entend certainly did, he might have had a different opinion. But you get this sense, right, that civilization is a thing that's needed for a fully human life. Then there's another important figure for understanding what Itard is doing in this book, and that is Rousseau in his work, The Social Contract from 1762. You're perhaps familiar with Rousseau because of the notion of the so-called noble savage. And you might get this idea that Rousseau is simply saying that humans before civilization are a wonderful thing. But reading further in The Social Contract, you can see that that's not quite the case. He says basically that we become fully human and we govern ourselves through becoming social beings, through becoming civilized, through developing a notion of self-love. He is stressing the importance of becoming social beings, to becoming fully rational beings. And so the noble savage, quote unquote, that Rousseau is famous for is just one step on the way to full humanity, according to him. So here's a quotation from Rousseau. We might over and above all this add to what man acquires in the civil state moral liberty, which alone makes him truly master of himself. For the mere impulse of appetite is slavery, that is being driven only by your desires, by hunger, for example. While obedience to a law, which we prescribe to ourselves, is liberty. True liberty comes from civilization. I want to stress the importance of those metaphors that Rousseau is using. Metaphors of slavery versus self-mastery are very important for him for understanding what it means to transition from being a primitive or uncivilized person to becoming a civilized person. I don't think those metaphors are accidental, particularly in the context of 18th century France and the enormous, increasing reliance on the labor of enslaved people in the Caribbean. So another important figure for understanding what Itard is doing is another French philosopher, a guy named Condillac, in his essay on the origin of human knowledge, which was published in 1746. So he has an important bit there about the development of language. He says that language begins with, he imagines two people, a boy and a girl, all by themselves. And he imagines how they develop language that begins with gesture. And then gradually language becomes more artificial, more detached from simply pointing at things, more arbitrary, therefore, where it's not simply a matter of, say, pointing at fire to indicate that you want fire, or grabbing an apple to show that you want an apple, but rather saying the word apple, which has no necessary connection to the word apple. And we have Itard making a similar argument on pages 106 and 107 of his work. I will read that to you. Many persons see in all these proceedings only the common instinctive actions of an animal, speaking about Victor of Aveyron. As for myself, I confess that I recognize in them the language of action. That's a phrase that comes from Condillac, in all its simplicity. That primitive language of the human species, originally employed in the infancy of society, before the labor of many ages had arranged and established the system of speech, and furnished to civilized man a fertile and sublime means of indefinite improvement, which calls forth his understanding even in his cradle, and of which, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's basically imagining that the early days of being human and the early days are like being an infant, are like being an animal, are like being a so-called savage. And that what happens as language increases in complexity is that our wants increase in complexity. Our desires become more complex. As our desires become more complex, our language correspondingly becomes more complex, and so on and so on and so on. So we have this notion that so-called savage people live a so-called simple life, and that civilized people lead a more, quote, complicated life, right? These are ideas that we can trace in part to people like Condillac. So this is the intellectual background for Itard. Then we can look at Itard. Okay, by the way, over here, Aveyron 2022, literally just got this from Instagram. The picture was taken today. So he makes an argument about the progress of animal, the savage, the civilized human. And the thing I really want to stress is that previous notions of feral children thought that they were ennobled by their isolation. Again, Romulus and Remus, because they are cut off from the general run of people and raised by a wolf, that this shows their nobility. They're not like other people. That's because they're powerful people, suitable to be the founder of a city. So they founded Rome, famously or legendarily. Whereas in the modern era, from the 13th and 14th century on, feral children are understood as deprived by their isolation. That's a huge transformation in these kinds of stories. So Itard belongs to that modern era. He argues that there is nothing recognizably human except through the imitation of other humans. So there is no human as such. There is human only in society, and that is only through imitation. That is the only place you can find anything recognizably human. There is no such thing as a man alone, because a man who's alone is no man at all. That's effectively what Itard is arguing. So here are some key quotations from his work. The way he talks about him as a simple child of nature, as being raised in the bosom of forests and far from the society of every rational being. He talks about him as inferior to the more intelligent of our domestic animals. And he says that the moral superiority which has been said to be natural to men, is merely the result of civilization which raises him above other animals. So what Itard believes he's doing is transforming this child from a not even quite animal savage into something that's better than an animal, and then finally into being a civilized human. And he's doing this by trying to give the boy speech. Now, we can say, and we'll talk about this more in class, that the problem here is that he's so dedicated to getting Itard to speak. It's possible that Victor cannot speak. Perhaps that's an issue here. And what he needs to be taught is sign language. And so we can talk a bit more about that context in class on Tuesday. Two other things, maybe just to get your brains flowing. This is some things just for you to think about, but I'm just struck by the fact that in the Truffaut film, where Truffaut, the director, plays Itard, that he cast a boy as Victor who wasn't white. I'm just really struck by that. So here he is over here. The actor's name is Jean-Pierre Cargol. Here he is as an adult playing guitar. He is of Roma background, so ultimately descended from people who are from northern India. There's another common name that's used for these people, which is a slur. So I won't say it here, but you can simply look up Roma if you don't know who these people are. And so I'm just struck by that. Of all the people that he cast, this is the boy he chose to cast. Now, he was related to a well-known guitarist, so possibly he was already known to Truffaut. Nonetheless, there's nothing in the Itard text that indicates the boy has a different skin color than the common run of French people. So I was just struck by that. The other thing that maybe I want to offer to you, and maybe you don't want to listen to this because there's going to be some curse words, but this is a poem by the poet Frank Ohara, who died at the age of 40, unfortunately, was struck by a Jeep in Long Island. But he wrote some wonderful poetry prior to that. And in collaboration with the artist Larry River, he worked with him to produce this lithograph with this text. Here's the poem that Frank O'Hara wrote. And I'm asking you to think about this as a different way of thinking about animals, and maybe to use this to contrast with some of the ways of thinking about animality that we've read about in some of the other texts we've looked at this semester. So this is my last point for this little talk. Here's the poem by Frank O'Hara. We join the animals, not when we fuck or shit, not when tear falls, but when, staring into light, we think. So the difference is he's saying we're not animal because we are tethered to our body and to so-called animal needs, but rather, well, the image he gives here is something that I think of with my cat, and the way the cat will sometimes stop and just stare into space for a while. And I wonder what it is she's doing when she's doing that. And for him to say, this is when we join with animals, when we do that too, I think it's just a wonderful and beautiful image. And so this is all I have to share with you for today. I look forward to talking to you on Tuesday.